They told her she didn't belong there. An old woman in civilian clothes, trying to enter the military graduation ceremony at Fort Stewart. Security turned her away at the gate, embarrassed family members whispering behind her back. She wore no uniform, carried no credentials, just a faded purse and determination in her weathered eyes. But when the commanding general spotted her from across the parade ground, he dropped his papers and ran. What he said next would silence 3,000 witnesses and change everything they thought they knew about respect. Welcome to Real Heroes Stories. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button to keep these voices alive. Dorothy Kellerman stood at the gates of Fort Stewart at 8:30 a.m. on a sweltering Georgia morning, clutching an invitation that had taken her 3 buses and 2 days to reach. The ceremony was for her grandson's graduation from basic combat training, the first in their family to serve since her late husband. She wore her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, the same one she'd worn to church for the past 15 years. At 73, she moved carefully but with purpose, her silver hair pinned back in a neat bun that revealed the sharp intelligence in her pale blue eyes. But there was something else in those eyes, something that spoke of authority long buried. The military police officer at the main gate barely looked up from his clipboard. Specialist Rodriguez, according to his name tape, had the practiced disinterest of someone who'd processed thousands of visitors. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification and your invitation." Dorothy fumbled through her purse with trembling fingers, producing a worn driver's license and the folded paper her grandson had sent. The young soldier examined the documents with the skeptical eye of someone trained to spot inconsistencies. "This invitation doesn't have a security clearance code," he said, his voice carrying institutional authority. "Without proper authorization, I can't let you on base." Dorothy's heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. She had spent her entire Social Security check for the month to make this journey from her small apartment in Valdosta, Georgia. Every dollar counted when you lived on $847 a month. "Please," she said quietly, her voice carrying a dignity that seemed out of place for someone being turned away. "My grandson Tyler sent this to me personally. He's graduating today with Charlie Company." The specialist shook his head with mechanical firmness. "Ma'am, I understand, but regulations are regulations. You'll need to contact your grandson's unit directly to get proper guest clearance." Behind Dorothy, a line of families with proper documentation grew restless. Expensive cars idled in the Georgia heat. She heard whispers, saw pointed looks. A well-dressed woman in a BMW called out impatiently, "Some people just don't understand how the military works." Dorothy felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but refused to move. She had made a promise to her late husband, Ronald, and Dorothy Kellerman had never broken a promise in her life. But here's what none of these people knew about the old woman in the blue dress, what they couldn't see beneath the civilian clothes and grandmother's demeanor. Between 1972 and 1994, Dorothy had been Staff Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell, United States Army. Not just any soldier, but a drill instructor at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. One of only 12 women selected for the Army's first integrated drill instructor program. For 22 years, she had been known by a different name among the recruits who trembled at her approach. They called her Iron Mitchell, and her reputation had spread throughout the entire training command like wildfire through dry grass. She could break down the cockiest teenager with a single look. Rebuild them with precision that bordered on surgical. Send them into the world as soldiers who would carry her lessons in their hearts forever. She had trained future generals who now commanded divisions. Medal of Honor recipients whose courage she had forged in the crucible of basic training. Special Forces operators who would go on to serve in conflicts most Americans would never hear about. But those days were buried now, hidden beneath decades of quiet civilian life. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. Dorothy watched helplessly as families streamed past her toward the parade ground, their laughter and excitement a stark contrast to her growing despair. She tried calling Tyler's unit from the visitor center phone, but got transferred between offices like a hot potato. Each person told her the same thing: too late to process visitor authorization. By 9:45 a.m., she was standing alone outside the fence, listening to the distant sound of the Army band warming up. That's when everything changed. Major General Harrison Blackstone was walking briskly toward the main gate, his dress blue uniform immaculate despite the Georgia heat. His chest was heavy with ribbons and decorations that told the story of a distinguished 37-year career. He was running late, having been delayed by an emergency briefing at division headquarters about a security situation developing overseas. As he approached the checkpoint, his eyes swept automatically across the area, a habit ingrained by decades of command responsibility. He stopped dead in his tracks. The briefing papers in his hand scattered to the ground like autumn leaves. There, standing outside the fence in a simple blue dress, was a face he hadn't seen in 37 years but would recognize anywhere. The same steel-gray eyes that had once reduced him to tears during his worst day of basic training. The same uncompromising posture that demanded respect without saying a word. The same woman who had quite literally saved his military career before it had even begun. His mind flashed back to a scorching summer day in 1987. Private Harrison Blackstone, 18 years old, cocky, disrespectful, and seemingly determined to wash out of basic training in spectacular fashion. He had arrived at Fort Jackson convinced he was God's gift to the military. Reality had hit him like a freight train. "Sergeant Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and something approaching reverence. Every head in the vicinity turned toward the two-star general who had just addressed the elderly woman everyone else had dismissed. The security guards snapped to attention when they saw Blackstone approaching, but their confusion was evident. Why was a major general addressing the old woman they had just turned away? Dorothy turned at the sound of her former name. Her eyes focused on the tall officer approaching her with quick, purposeful strides. For a moment, time collapsed like an accordion. She saw not the decorated general with silver hair and command presence, but a skinny kid from rural Alabama who had thought he knew everything about everything. "Harrison?" she said quietly. And in that single word was the voice that had once commanded absolute authority over entire companies of recruits. "Is that really you, son?" But what happened next would do more than reunite a drill sergeant with her former recruit, because General Blackstone had been carrying a secret for 37 years. A secret about the day Drill Sergeant Mitchell had done something that went against every regulation in the book. Something that had saved not just his career, but his life. And now, standing at the gates of Fort Stewart, he was about to repay a debt that had haunted him for decades. The general approached the fence separating them, his eyes never leaving her face. Around them, the crowd grew silent as witnesses to something they didn't yet understand. "Specialist Rodriguez," he said, without turning toward the gate guard, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that made colonels jump. "Open this gate immediately." As the gate swung open with a metallic clang, General Blackstone stepped through and came to attention in front of Dorothy Kellerman. Then, in front of 3,000 people, who had gathered for the graduation ceremony. A two-star general in the United States Army did something that shattered every protocol in the manual. He saluted a civilian in a blue dress. "Drill sergeant," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd like a gunshot. "Permission to escort you to the ceremony, ma'am." But his voice carried something else, something that made nearby soldiers exchange glances. Fear. Not of Dorothy, but for what she might say next. Because General Blackstone knew that Drill Sergeant Mitchell held a secret that could destroy everything he had built. Dorothy felt tears she hadn't allowed herself in years spring to her eyes. But her voice, when she spoke, carried the same steel that had shaped the careers of countless soldiers. "Permission granted, General, but first—" She paused, her eyes scanning his uniform with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades ensuring soldiers met Army standards. "Your ribbon rack is crooked." She reached up and straightened his decorations with the practiced motion of someone who had done this thousands of times. Around them, the crowd held its breath. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Much better. Now you look like the soldier I remember." But as they began walking toward the ceremony together, Dorothy had no idea that this moment was about to change everything. Not just her day, not just her grandson's graduation, but the entire trajectory of her remaining years. Because General Blackstone had been searching for 37 years for a way to repay the woman who had saved him. And fate had just handed him the perfect opportunity to give her something she had lost long ago. Something that would make her remember who she really was. The walk across the parade ground felt like a journey through time itself. Every step Dorothy took beside General Blackstone carried the weight of 37 years of buried memories. Soldiers snapped to attention as they passed, their eyes wide with confusion and curiosity. Who was this elderly woman in civilian clothes that commanded such respect from their commanding general? But Dorothy barely noticed the attention. Her mind was racing back to that summer of 1987, to a young private who had almost destroyed his own future. "You haven't changed much, Harrison," she said quietly as they walked, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had once shaped thousands of soldiers. "Still walking too fast. Still trying to be somewhere you're not supposed to be yet." General Blackstone slowed his pace immediately, a reflex that surprised even him. 37 years of command experience, and he was still responding to Drill Sergeant Mitchell's corrections like a green recruit. "Some habits die hard, Drill Sergeant," he replied, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and something deeper. Gratitude mixed with old fear. "I've thought about you every day since Fort Jackson. What you did for me that night." His voice trailed off as they approached the main ceremony area. Families were seated in neat rows, their conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. But what General Blackstone didn't say, what he couldn't say in front of 3,000 witnesses, was the complete truth about that night in 1987. The night when Private Harrison Blackstone had been caught attempting to go AWOL. The night when regulations demanded his immediate discharge from the Army. The night when Drill Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell had made a decision that would haunt and define both of their lives forever. The ceremony was already beginning as they reached the VIP seating area. Colonel Sandra Hayes, the base commander, looked up in surprise as General Blackstone approached with an unscheduled guest. "General, we weren't expecting. We don't have seating arrangements for—" She gestured helplessly toward Dorothy, clearly uncertain how to address the situation. "Colonel Hayes," General Blackstone said, with the calm authority of someone accustomed to solving problems on the spot. "I'd like you to meet retired Staff Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell. She'll be joining us in the VIP section today." The colonel's eyes widened slightly. The name Mitchell meant something in military circles, though she couldn't quite place it. "Of course, General." Right this way, Sergeant Mitchell. As they took their seats, Dorothy felt the familiar mixture of pride and melancholy that always accompanied military ceremonies. The sight of young soldiers in their dress uniforms, standing at attention with their futures spread out before them, like blank pages waiting to be written. She had seen this scene thousands of times, had been responsible for preparing many of these young men and women for this exact moment. But here's what was happening that Dorothy couldn't see. In the ranks of graduating soldiers, word was spreading like wildfire. The old lady with the general. Someone said she's a drill sergeant. Which drill sergeant? The drill sergeant. Iron Mitchell. From the stories. Eyes began to turn toward the VIP section, where Dorothy sat with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned her place through decades of service. Tyler Mitchell, Dorothy's grandson, stood in formation with Charlie Company, his heart pounding not from ceremony nerves, but from disbelief. His grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his parents died, the woman who had never spoken about her military service, was sitting in the VIP section next to a 2-star general. Tyler had always known there was something different about his grandmother, something that explained her insistence on discipline, her way of making a bed with hospital corners, her ability to spot a lie from across a room. The ceremony commander's voice boomed across the parade ground through the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of colors." 3,000 people stood as one, hands over hearts, as the color guard marched forward with the precision that only comes from endless hours of practice. Dorothy rose with the rest, but her posture was different. Straighter, more commanding. The civilian grandmother was fading away, replaced by something harder, more authoritative. General Blackstone watched her transformation with growing amazement. It was as if the years were peeling away with each passing moment. The uncertain elderly woman at the gate was becoming the drill sergeant Mitchell he remembered, the woman who could silence an entire barracks with a single look, the woman who had saved his life when regulations would have destroyed it. "Drill sergeant," he whispered during a pause in the ceremony, "I need to tell you something." About that night at Fort Jackson. About what really happened. Dorothy turned to look at him, her steel-gray eyes focused with laser intensity. "Not here, son," she said quietly. "Some conversations require privacy." But fate had other plans for their reunion. As the ceremony continued, a young captain from the base protocol office approached Colonel Hayes with an urgent expression. "Ma'am, we have a situation," he whispered. "The media is here. Channel 7 News got word that there's a story developing about a legendary drill sergeant attending the ceremony. They want an interview." Colonel Hayes felt her stomach drop. Media attention on a military ceremony was always complicated, but this was potentially explosive. If Dorothy Mitchell really was the Iron Mitchell from the stories, if half the legends about her were true, this could become a national news story. "Where are they now?" she asked. "Setting up cameras near the east entrance," the captain replied. "They're asking specifically about Staff Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell and her connection to General Blackstone." Apparently, someone in the crowd recognized her and called it in. Colonel Hayes looked toward Dorothy and the general, who were absorbed in watching the graduation ceremony, unaware of the developing media storm. Meanwhile, in the graduating formation, something remarkable was happening. Word had spread through the ranks that Iron Mitchell herself was in attendance. These young soldiers had grown up hearing stories about the legendary drill sergeant who had trained some of the Army's greatest heroes. To them, she was mythology made flesh. Private Jessica Chen, standing in the front rank, felt her spine straighten even more as she thought about the woman watching from the VIP section. The ceremony reached its climax as the graduating soldiers took their oath of commitment to the United States Army. Dorothy felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched her grandson raise his right hand with his fellow soldiers. This was why she had made the journey. This was the moment she had promised Ronald she would witness. But it was also something more. It was a reminder of who she had been, who she might still be beneath the years of quiet retirement. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. The voices rang out in unison across the parade ground. Dorothy found herself mouthing the words along with them, muscle memory from decades of administering this same oath to countless young soldiers. The words had weight. They meant something. They demanded something from those who spoke them. As the oath concluded, and the new soldiers were dismissed to find their families, chaos erupted. But it wasn't the happy chaos of families reuniting with their newly graduated soldiers. It was the focused chaos of media attention suddenly converging on a single point. News cameras were moving toward the VIP section. Reporters were pushing through crowds of families, and military police were scrambling to maintain order. "Drill Sergeant," General Blackstone said urgently. "We need to move." Now, he had spotted the approaching media storm and knew that Dorothy was about to be thrust into a spotlight she had never asked for. But as he started to guide her toward the rear exit, something unexpected happened. Dorothy stopped walking. "No," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded entire training companies. "I'm not running from anything." She turned to face the approaching cameras and reporters, her posture straightening, her chin lifting with the pride of someone who had spent 22 years serving her country with distinction. But what Dorothy didn't know, what General Blackstone hadn't had time to tell her, was that her decision to stand and face the media was about to unleash a story that went far beyond a drill sergeant attending her grandson's graduation. Because the secret that General Blackstone had carried for 37 years was about to become front-page news. And once that story broke, nothing would ever be the same for either of them. The first reporter reached them just as Tyler Mitchell broke from formation and began running toward his grandmother, his new soldier's uniform still crisp and perfect. The collision of past and present, of legend and reality, was about to create a moment that would be remembered long after the last reporter had filed their story. "Sergeant Mitchell," the first reporter called out, camera crew in tow. "Is it true that you're the Iron Mitchell?" The drill sergeant who trained Medal of Honor recipients. Dorothy looked directly into the camera lens, her steel-gray eyes unflinching, and for the first time in 29 years, she spoke her military truth. "Staff Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell, United States Army, retired," she said with the precision of someone who had spent decades in uniform. "And yes, I am here to see my grandson graduate." But her words carried an undertone that made General Blackstone's blood run cold, because he knew that tone. It was the tone Dorothy Mitchell used when she was about to reveal a truth that would change everything. The cameras pressed closer, more reporters arrived, drawn by the growing crowd and the unmistakable energy of a breaking story. Channel 7's lead reporter, Sarah Chen, pushed through the crowd with the aggressive persistence that had made her career. "Sergeant Mitchell, there are stories that you single-handedly changed military training protocols. Is it true that you once prevented a recruit from committing suicide?" The question hit like a physical blow. General Blackstone's face went white as bone. Dorothy looked directly into the camera, her steel-gray eyes unwavering. "Young lady, there are some stories that aren't meant for television." But the damage was done. The secret that had haunted General Blackstone for 37 years was suddenly inches away from public exposure. His career, his reputation, everything he had built since that night at Fort Jackson hung in the balance of whatever Dorothy chose to say next. Tyler Mitchell finally reached them, breathless from his sprint across the parade ground. His new army uniform was still crisp, his boots polished to mirror shine, but his face showed the confusion of someone whose entire understanding of his family had just been shattered. "Grandma?" he said, his voice barely audible above the growing crowd noise. "What's happening? Who are all these people?" Dorothy turned toward her grandson, and for a moment the iron Mitchell facade cracked. Here was the boy she had raised after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. The boy who had never known about her military service because she had buried it so deeply. The boy who was now a man, a soldier, standing before her in the same uniform she had worn with such pride decades ago. "Tyler," she said gently, reaching out to straighten his collar with the automatic gesture of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. "These nice people want to know about your grandmother's war stories." But her voice carried layers of meaning that only General Blackstone understood. She was giving him a choice: confess the truth now, or watch her tell the story her way. But what none of them realized was that this moment was being broadcast live. Channel 7 had gone to breaking news coverage, and across Georgia, people were stopping what they were doing to watch the elderly woman who was commanding such extraordinary respect from a 2-star general. In living rooms and break rooms, in offices and restaurants, people were asking the same question: who is Dorothy Mitchell? The answer was more complicated than anyone could imagine. Because the story of that night in 1987 wasn't just about a young soldier's mistake. It was about a decision that had saved a life, yes, but had also violated every regulation in the military justice system. It was about a drill sergeant who had risked her own career to give a broken young man a second chance. And it was about the debt that General Harrison Blackstone had carried ever since. "General Blackstone," another reporter called out, "can you comment on your relationship with Sergeant Mitchell?" "Our research shows that you both served at Fort Jackson in 1987. The general looked like a man watching his entire career flash before his eyes. The carefully constructed reputation, the decades of exemplary service, the trust of subordinates and superiors alike, all of it balanced on the edge of a story that could destroy everything. Dorothy watched the fear in his eyes and made a decision that would surprise everyone. "Son," she said, using the voice that had once commanded entire training companies, "it's time to tell the truth. All of it." She turned back to the cameras, her posture straightening even more, if that was possible. But not here. Not like this. Some stories require dignity. General Blackstone felt something he hadn't experienced since that night in 1987. Relief mixed with terror. Dorothy was giving him control of the narrative, but she was also holding him accountable. The debt was finally coming due, but she was allowing him to pay it with honor intact. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Blackstone said, his command voice cutting through the crowd noise like a blade, "I will be holding a press conference at 3 p.m. today to discuss my relationship with Staff Sergeant Mitchell and the events of 1987. Until then, I ask that you respect both her privacy and the dignity of these young soldiers' graduation ceremony." But the reporters weren't satisfied with a delayed story. "General, can you at least confirm whether the incident reports from Fort Jackson were accurate? Sergeant Mitchell, did you really violate direct orders to save a recruit's life? Is it true that you covered up a suicide attempt?" The questions came like artillery fire, each one more dangerous than the last. Tyler looked between his grandmother and the general, trying to process information that seemed to come from an alternate universe. His grandmother, the woman who had raised him with quiet strength and unwavering discipline, was apparently a military legend. The general, one of the most powerful men in the army, was treating her with a respect that bordered on reverence. And there was a secret between them that seemed to terrify one and empower the other. "Grandma," Tyler said quietly, stepping closer to shield her from the pressing cameras. "We don't have to do this. We can leave right now." But Dorothy shook her head, with the same certainty she had shown that night in 1987, when she had made the most important decision of her military career. "No, Tyler," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult choices. "Some debts have to be paid. Some truths have to be told." She looked directly at General Blackstone. "Harrison, you've carried this burden long enough. It's time to set it down. Here's what had happened that night in 1987. The story that was about to reshape both their lives. Private Harrison Blackstone had been caught attempting to go AWOL after receiving news that his younger sister had been killed in a drunk driving accident. Regulations demanded his immediate discharge. But Drill Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell had seen something in the broken young man that others had missed. Instead of following protocol, she had made an unauthorized decision that violated direct orders. She had spent the entire night talking him through his grief, sharing her own losses, helping him understand that running away would dishonor his sister's memory. By dawn, she had convinced him to stay, to honor his commitment, to become the soldier she knew he could be. But to make it official, she had falsified his location report and covered up his attempted departure. If discovered, both their careers would have been over. The cover-up had held for 37 years. Harrison Blackstone had gone on to become one of the Army's most respected generals. Dorothy Mitchell had retired quietly, never seeking recognition for the countless lives she had shaped. But now, in front of cameras and reporters, the truth was finally coming to light. "General," Sarah Chen pressed, "our sources indicate that there were significant irregularities in Private Blackstone's service record from 1987. Can you address those?" General Blackstone looked at Dorothy, seeing in her eyes the same steel that had saved him decades ago. She nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak. "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to confess. "There were irregularities, and Staff Sergeant Mitchell saved my life by creating them." The crowd fell silent. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the revelation that would make careers and end others. But Dorothy stepped forward before he could continue. "That's enough for now," she said with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Harrison, remember what I taught you about timing. Some stories need the right setting." She turned to the reporters, every inch the drill sergeant despite her civilian clothes. "You want the truth? You'll get it. But you'll get it properly, with dignity and respect for the institution we both served." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, but the damage was done. The story was out, partial and tantalizing. Within hours, it would be national news. The drill sergeant who had saved a general's career, the violation of regulations that had changed 2 lives forever, the secret that had shaped 37 years of military service. As the reporters moved away and the graduation ceremony finally concluded, Tyler approached his grandmother with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Grandma, I don't understand any of this." "You never told me you were in the Army. You never told me about any of this." Dorothy reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses that came from military training, seeing in his face the same determination she had once seen in Harrison Blackstone. "Tyler," she said gently, There are some stories that wait for the right time to be told. Some lessons that can only be learned when you're ready to hear them. She looked at his new soldier's uniform, seeing the pride and uncertainty in his young face. Your real education is just beginning. General Blackstone approached them as the crowd continued to thin. Drill Sergeant, he said formally, I owe you more than an explanation. I owe you everything. Dorothy looked at this accomplished man, this general who commanded thousands of soldiers, and saw the scared 18-year-old she had saved all those years ago. Son, she said, using the voice that had shaped his character, you don't owe me anything. You earned every rank, every decoration, every bit of respect through your own service. What I did that night wasn't about saving your career. It was about saving a young man who had lost his way. She paused, her eyes taking in the emptying parade ground, the scattered families, the residual energy of the ceremony. But now, she continued, her voice carrying a weight that made both men straighten unconsciously, it's time to finish what we started. The truth has a way of demanding payment, and we've kept the books balanced for 37 years. Time to close them properly. What Dorothy didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this moment was about to trigger a chain of events that would reach far beyond Fort Stewart. Military investigators were already being notified. Congressional inquiries would be launched. A general's career would hang in the balance, not because of what he had done, but because of what a drill sergeant had done to save him. But standing there in the Georgia heat, surrounded by the remnants of Tyler's graduation ceremony, Dorothy Mitchell felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. She felt like a soldier again. And soldiers, she knew, always finished the mission. The mission that had started 37 years ago was finally approaching its conclusion. But the ending would surprise everyone involved, because Dorothy Mitchell had one more card to play, one more truth to reveal, one more lesson to teach about the real meaning of honor, duty, and sacrifice. The cameras might be gone for now, but they would be back. And when they returned, Dorothy Mitchell would be ready to tell the complete story. The story of what really happened that night in 1987. The story that would either destroy a general's career or prove that sometimes the greatest act of service is knowing when to break the rules. 3 hours later, at exactly 3 p.m., the base conference room was packed beyond capacity. News crews from major networks had arrived. Military officials sat in tense silence, and Tyler Mitchell stood at the back of the room, still trying to process everything he had learned about his grandmother. Dorothy sat at the head table next to General Blackstone, her civilian clothes a stark contrast to the sea of uniforms surrounding her. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Blackstone began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. 37 years ago, Staff Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell saved my life. Not in combat, not on a battlefield, but in a moment when I had lost all hope and was about to destroy my own future. The room was silent, except for the soft whir of cameras recording every word. Dorothy watched Harrison with the same intense focus she had once used to evaluate young recruits, seeing in his face the courage it took to voluntarily end his own career for the sake of truth. On the night of July 23, 1987, I was caught attempting to go AWOL from Fort Jackson, the general continued. I had just received news that my 18-year-old sister, Sarah, had been killed by a drunk driver. I was broken, angry, and convinced that nothing in my life mattered anymore. Military police found me climbing the perimeter fence at 2:30 a.m. with a bus ticket to Alabama and a decision to never return. Sarah Chen from Channel 7 leaned forward, her pen poised over her notepad. This was the story that would define her career. The moment when a two-star general confessed to a crime that should have ended his military service before it began. "According to regulations," General Blackstone said, his voice growing stronger, "I should have been immediately court-martialed for attempted desertion. My military career should have ended that night. But Staff Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Dorothy felt the weight of every eye in the room turning toward her. For 29 years, she had lived as a civilian, her military service buried so deeply that even her own grandson had never known about it. But sitting here now, facing the cameras and the questions, she felt something awakening inside her. The drill sergeant who had shaped thousands of young lives was still there, still ready to serve. "Tell them what really happened that night, Harrison," she said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. "Tell them about the choice we both made." General Blackstone nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Drill Sergeant Mitchell found me in the holding cell at 3:15 a.m. Instead of processing my discharge papers, she asked the MPs to give us privacy. For the next 6 hours, she sat with me in that cell and helped me understand something I couldn't see, through my grief." Tyler moved closer to the front of the room, desperate to hear every detail of a story that was rewriting everything he thought he knew about his family. "She told me about her brother Michael, who had been killed in Vietnam when she was 19, the general continued. "She told me about the night she had almost quit the army herself, consumed by the same grief and anger that was destroying me. And she told me something that changed my life forever." Dorothy stood up, her posture automatically straightening into the bearing that had commanded respect for over 2 decades. "I told him that running away wouldn't honor his sister's memory," she said, her drill sergeant voice filling the room with undeniable authority. "I told him that the best way to honor the dead is to live with purpose, to serve something greater than our own pain." "But more than that," General Blackstone added, "she showed me what real leadership looked like. Not following regulations blindly, but making the hard choice to do what's right, even when it costs you everything." The questions came immediately. "General, are you saying that Sergeant Mitchell helped you escape punishment for attempted desertion? Did she falsify official documents? How long has this cover-up been in place?" Dorothy raised her hand, and the room fell silent with the same automatic response she had commanded in thousands of training situations. "Let me be clear about what happened that night," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "At 6 a.m. on July 24, 1987, Private Harrison Blackstone was officially listed as present for duty. His attempted departure was never reported to the Criminal Investigation Division. I destroyed the MP report and convinced the guards to forget what they had seen." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Military reporters frantically scribbled notes while television cameras captured every word of what amounted to a confession of serious violations of military law. "I violated direct orders from my commanding officer," Dorothy continued, her voice never wavering. "I falsified official records. I obstructed justice according to military regulations, and I would do it again tomorrow if faced with the same choice." Tyler felt his heart pounding as he watched his grandmother confess to crimes that could have landed her in military prison. But he also felt something else. Overwhelming pride in the woman who had raised him with such quiet strength and unwavering moral courage. "Why?" Sarah Chen called out. "Why risk your own career for one soldier?" Dorothy turned to face the reporter directly, her steel-gray eyes reflecting decades of hard-earned wisdom. "Because I didn't see a deserter that night. I saw a young man who was drowning in grief and needed someone to throw him a lifeline. I saw potential that was about to be wasted because of rigid adherence to regulations that couldn't account for human suffering." General Blackstone stood beside her, knowing that this moment would define the rest of both their lives. "She saved more than my career that night," he said. She taught me that true leadership sometimes means having the courage to do what's right, even when it's not what's easy or legal or safe. "And what did you do with that lesson?" another reporter asked. "I spent the next 37 years trying to live up to her example," the general replied. "Every decision I made as a leader was filtered through the question, what would Drill Sergeant Mitchell do? How would she balance regulations with compassion? How would she put the welfare of soldiers above the convenience of the system?" Dorothy felt tears welling in her eyes as she listened to this accomplished man describe the impact of one night's decision. "Harrison, you don't owe me anything," she said softly. "You earned every rank, every decoration, every bit of respect through your own service and sacrifice." "But I do owe you something," he insisted. "I owe you the truth. And I owe you the acknowledgement that the leader I became was shaped by the leader you already were." The room buzzed with the sound of reporters conferring with their editors, military officials making urgent phone calls, and the general murmur of people trying to process the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Tyler finally found his voice. "Grandma," he called out from the back of the room, "why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" Dorothy turned toward her grandson, seeing in his young face the same mixture of pride and confusion she had seen in Harrison's eyes 37 years ago. "Tyler, come here," she said, and the crowd parted to let him through. When he reached the front of the room, Dorothy placed her hands on his shoulders with the same gentle authority she had used to straighten his collar earlier that morning. "Some stories wait for the right time to be told," she said. "Some lessons can only be learned when you're ready to hear them." "But I'm ready now," Tyler said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to know everything. I want to know about the woman who raised me." Dorothy smiled, and for the first time all day, the smile reached her eyes. "The woman who raised you is the same woman who sat in that cell with Harrison. The same woman who believed that compassion is not weakness, that rules serve people, and not the other way around, and that sometimes the most important duty is the one that no regulation can define." She turned back to the cameras, knowing that this moment was being broadcast across the country, that her words would be analyzed and debated for years to come. "I want every young soldier watching this to understand something," she said, her drill sergeant voice carrying absolute conviction. "Honor is not about following orders blindly. Duty is not about rigid adherence to regulations. Service is about having the courage to do what's right even when it costs you everything." General Blackstone nodded, knowing that this was the lesson that had defined his entire career. "Drill Sergeant Mitchell taught me that true leadership is not about the authority you hold, but about the lives you touch and the futures you help shape." As the press conference concluded and the cameras stopped rolling, Tyler approached his grandmother with a new understanding of the woman who had raised him. "Grandma, I'm proud to be your grandson," he said simply. Dorothy pulled him into a hug, feeling the strong shoulders of the young soldier he had become, remembering the frightened 8-year-old she had taken in after his parents' death. "And I'm proud of the man you've become, Tyler. Your real education starts now, but you're ready for it." As they walked out of the conference room together, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. She felt complete. The debt had been paid, the truth had been told, and the lesson had been passed to a new generation. General Harrison Blackstone would face a military investigation that would ultimately exonerate him, determining that the positive impact of his leadership over 37 years far outweighed the irregular circumstances of his early career. He would retire with full honors, his legacy defined not by the rules he had broken, but by the lives he had changed. Dorothy Mitchell would return to her quiet life in Valdosta, but with a difference. Letters would arrive daily from soldiers whose lives had been touched by her story. Invitations would come to speak at military academies, and leadership conferences. The woman who had spent decades in obscurity would find her voice again, teaching new generations of leaders about the true meaning of honor, duty, and service. And Tyler Mitchell would begin his military career with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve. He would carry his grandmother's lessons with him through every challenge, every decision, every moment when regulations conflicted with compassion. The mission that had begun 37 years ago in a holding cell at Fort Jackson was finally complete. Not because a secret had been revealed, but because a truth had been passed on. The truth that the greatest act of service is sometimes knowing when to break the rules to save a life. Some heroes wear their medals on their chest. Others carry them in their hearts, invisible but unbreakable, shaping the future one decision at a time. Dorothy Mitchell was both.